The drilling started around 3 a.m. I opened my eyes with a jolt, instantly awake and confused in the pitch-black humidity of the room. My room, although it was still unfamiliar. As I let the shape of my nightstand and the books piled on top of it form in the darkness, the muffled mechanic whirring continued below me. I kicked the sweaty sheets off my body in a tangled heap and I heaved myself off the mattress, immediately stubbing my toe on an unpacked box of picture frames. Of course, I hadn't plugged in a lamp yet. Shit, I hissed and I tiptoed to the door around more boxes and bins, a landmine of my procrastination. I made my way downstairs and I peered into the living room. It was blindingly bright with all of the lights turned on. The overhead fan, both lamps on either side of the couch, and even the glow of the quiet TV showing a rerun of Family Feud. My dad was crouched down by the front door, drill in hand, and installing what looked like a military-grade padlock beneath the knob. His toolbox was open on the floor, its contents scattered around him, and his face was scrunched up in concentration. He was mumbling something to himself. "Dad?" I whispered. He jumped, dropping the drill onto the toolbox with a loud clattering, his mouth open in horror. When he turned and saw me, he exhaled and he clutched his chest. "Jesus, you scared me half to death," he said with a nervous chuckle. "What's going on? You should be in bed." "I could say the same thing," I said. "You're the one using power tools at 3 in the morning. Is it that late?" He laughed again. That same weird nervous chittering that was so unlike him, and looked down at his watch. "I must have lost track of time. I'll keep it down, sorry." "Dad, what are you doing?" I asked, crossing my arms over the baggy t-shirt I wore to bed. "We didn't have a decent lock on this door," he said simply. "You know, this house hasn't had any updates since the 70s. Anyone could come breaking in here and steal something. For all we know, a couple of hobos could have been using this place as a crack den before we moved in." I raised an eyebrow. "A crack den in a cul-de-sac?" "You know what I mean," he muttered. He ran a shaky hand through his thinning hair. I spotted 2 empty beer bottles on the coffee table and a third one half full next to the toolbox. "I'm sorry I woke you up. You should really get to bed." "Dad, try and get some sleep. And then maybe I can get some sleep. No more drilling, okay?" "Okay," he answered without looking at me, his bloodshot eyes focused on the wall behind me. "Good night." I stumbled sleepily back upstairs when my parents' bedroom door opened a crack. My mom poked her head out into the hallway, her hair a mess of matted curls. "Again?" she asked me in a strained voice. I nodded and we shared a look of concern. Dad has never been an insomniac, but ever since we moved to our new house a little over a week ago, he stayed awake all hours of the night. The first night was normal enough. He was up late unpacking, but Mom and I found him sitting upright in the armchair the next morning, wide awake and trembling. The next night, I heard him pacing when I got up to use the bathroom, peering downstairs to see him walking back and forth in the living room, the floorboards creaking gently beneath him as he muttered to himself. And the following nights had followed a similar pattern. I would wake up to hear him trudging up the stairs after the sun had come up. He was a writer, mostly of personal essays and non-fiction pieces, but he was never this secretive or consumed with his work. Now whenever we found him bent over his laptop or scribbling furiously into his notebook, he would pack up his belongings and shuffle into the next empty room. This was the first night he had incorporated light home construction and, as far as I knew, beer into his routine. Dad had never been a drinker either. The next day, while my dad snoozed the day away in his room, my mom rehashed the same conversation we'd been having for days. "He needs medication," she said, matter-of-factly. "Ambien or something. Do you see what he did to the door? It's not natural to be up all night like that. He's teaching freshmen at 8 a.m. in a few weeks." Both of my parents were English professors at the local college, and part of the reason for our move. While my mom had taken on teaching afternoon and evening summer courses, my dad had the season off, and fortunately for him, given his current predicament. But the fall semester was rapidly approaching. I chalked most of his antics up to anxiety over living so far from the city. He was used to the noise, the people, and the chaos. And now, we were the only house on a small, dead-end street a few miles from campus, shrouded by trees. After my mom left for class through the garage, I examined the living room, looking for any signs of remaining bottles. Our front door was now armed with a heavy deadbolt towards the top, as well as a chain at eye level. I balked at the level of security my dad had taken, and I unlocked each one. I turned the knob, but it wouldn't budge. I had missed the heavy padlock at the bottom. I tugged it to no avail. Then I stood to run my fingers on the top of the doorframe, searching for a key. There was nothing, though. Jesus, Dad, I whispered to myself, bending down to examine the lock. He must have dropped quite a few things in the process, too. Long white scratches marred the floor, disappearing underneath the door. Fueled by annoyance and concern, I jogged upstairs and quietly entered my parents' room. Dad was still snoring soundly as I unplugged the MacBook from its charging place in the bureau and I stuck it back out. Downstairs, I typed in my middle name and birthday as the password prompt and began my search. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I was hoping to find some clues for his odd behavior. The desktop was littered with folders holding files from old student essays, photos from family vacations, and other miscellaneous crap. All labeled accordingly, but I couldn't find any new projects. When I checked his internet browser history, something caught my attention. I clicked the link and pulled up an article published in a newspaper only a few months before. Family of 4 found butchered inside home. A red-haired couple, each holding red-headed toddler boys in their laps and what looked like a Christmas portrait, smiled out at me from the grainy featured photograph. The details were chilling. The father was found in the bedroom, decapitated, his head only a few feet away from the body. The mother was found in the children's room, her body splayed on top of one of the beds in what police determined was a protective move. One of the boys was found underneath her, both bodies hacked to bits. The younger boy was found in the bedroom, and the hallway, and the bathroom. His body parts were strewn throughout the house. I shook my head in disgust and I clicked back into the browser history. A much less graphic story about the family had been published to another news site, and this time with a video. The reporter interviewed shocked neighbors who all repeated the same mantra. They seemed like a nice family, but nobody knew them well. They had just moved in and terrible things like this never happened in their town. The police chief looked stricken as he disclosed that there were no leads, no suspects, and no signs of forced entry. And I clicked back again. To my horror, there were more articles. Not just about this red-haired family and their smiling boys. There were others too. A mother and a daughter disemboweled in their country home. A man found dead in his duplex, the lower half of his body torn away. 3 brothers hacked to bits in a locked room. A young couple eviscerated in their own bed in what police thought looked like an animal attack, only they lived on the 22nd floor of their apartment building. The stories were from all over the country, but the only thing that gruesome murders had in common was that all the victims were new residents. After only a few days of moving into their new homes, apartments, wherever, they were found dead. No known suspects, no explanation. I must have been reading for hours, paralyzed with fear as shadows stretched across the room, the brightest light coming from the laptop screen. I had clicked through so much carnage, my stomach was rolling. Even though I tried to explain to myself that this was just essay material, just fodder for my dad's next big writing gig, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong with him. It'll be back tonight. I jumped at the sound of my dad's voice. I strained to see him, blue circles dancing in front of my eyes in the darkness, standing at the bottom of the stairs. He turned the overhead light on with a click and I squinted from the sudden brightness. He was wearing the same disheveled clothes from the night before. What? Wordlessly, my dad moved slowly into the kitchen. I put down the laptop and I followed him, watching as he opened the fridge and leaned down for a beer bottle, twisting off the cap and guzzling down half before wiping his mouth. He turned to me with tired, bloodshot eyes. "I'm sorry," he said sadly. "I didn't want to bring you into this." "Not yet." "What do you mean?" I asked in a shaky voice. What will be back tonight? I don't know what it is, he admitted. And frankly, I don't want to know. But I think I figured out how it works, I guess. I'm not sure. There are still questions. How what works? What the hell are you talking about? I practically shouted. You're really scaring me. He sighed and he leaned on the kitchen counter, bracing himself with one hand and closing his eyes. Since we've got here, I've been hearing these horrible voices, he said. Inhumane voices. Animals and not. I know them. But they still say awful things. Terrible things, and sometimes they're not just voices. Sometimes I can see them. What do you see, Dad? I asked, my heart in my throat. He opened his mouth to speak, his face contorting with the struggle, but he was at a loss. He shrugged helplessly and he shook his head, closing his eyes. If this was a joke, it wasn't my dad's style. He was blunt and honest, almost to a fault, and he wouldn't indulge in a prank like this. Whatever was happening, he truly believed it was real. Dad, are you? I started, unsure if I could finish the question. Are you drinking when you hear these voices? He looked up at me with a furrowed brow and he laughed gruffly, without humor. You'll see for yourself. Soon. He finished the rest of his bottle and placed it on the counter, heading back into the living room, leaving me alone, my body shivering from a sudden cold. It was almost midnight. Dad and I were sitting in the living room, our hands wrapped around mugs of coffee. I didn't think he needed any help staying awake anymore, like I did, but I was just thankful he had put the beer away at my request. Mom had brought home burgers for dinner from the campus diner around 7. She tried to strike up a conversation with Dad and me, but we were pretty quiet, only murmuring in response to her story about an embarrassing typo in her PowerPoint slides. Eventually she grew frustrated and declared she was going to bed early since we were positively boring her to death and maybe we all needed to sleep more, and I was glad for her absence. I still hadn't decided what I was going to say to her. I mean, how do you tell someone that her husband is clearly unstable? And now it was just me and Dad, sitting and waiting. Waiting for what? I didn't know. But I owed him one night to buy into his delusions before figuring out what to do about it. I checked my phone a few times, scrolling through my Facebook feed without absorbing anything. The TV was off and all I could hear was the ticking of the clock. How much longer? I asked. It depends, he answered. On what? I don't know, he said. Oh, I said dumbly. And back to silence. I must have dozed off in my chair because it was nearly 2 a.m. when I felt my dad shaking me awake. Hey, he whispered. Wake up. It's here. What's here? I almost asked before, remembering with an unpleasant sinking feeling this little game I was indulging in. As my eyes adjusted to the light, I saw he was holding a shotgun in both hands. What? When in the hell did you get that gun? I nearly shrieked with a voice hoarse from sleep. Put that down! Dad crouched by the door, setting the gun across his knees and putting his ear against the wood in deep concentration. It's here, he whispered again, to himself more than me. He looked at me with wide, wild eyes. Do you believe me now? I sat up in my chair and I strained to hear, well, anything. But it was just the ticking of the clock and my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. I waited nearly a minute before sighing and standing. Dad, I don't hear. Come outside, Daddy, a voice hissed. I froze, icy fear spreading through my veins. I couldn't tell what it was. I looked at my dad in panic. Daddy, I'm so cold. Please come outside. The voice called again. It sounded like a child, but it was off. Like somebody was mimicking a voice. Underneath the high-pitched trill, I could hear a faint, gravelly echo. And there was something so familiar about it. I had heard this voice before. Dad, I whispered, drawing closer and kneeling to join him on the floor. Who is that? Who's talking to you? He looked at me sadly. It's you. Daddy, please, I'm scared. The hollow voice grew louder, like it had his mouth pressed right up against the door. I realized with horror that it was my voice, or at least my younger voice. Something I had only heard in the shaky audio of VHS home movies my parents had recorded with handheld cameras. Once I recognized it, the slight childish lisp I carried at 6 years old after I lost my 2 front teeth. It was uncanny. How was that possible? I asked my dad, but he didn't answer, listening intently to whatever was on the other side of the door. I know you're in there, Daddy. Why won't you come outside? I don't know, my dad whispered back, but it'll get worse. Nathaniel, is that you? I need you, sweetie. I nearly choked at the sound of my name. It was my mother's voice, which was impossible because she was upstairs and sleeping, blissfully unaware like I had been the past week. Nathaniel, come outside right now. I won't ask again. It was the stern voice my mother only used when I was a child and I was in trouble. It knows you're here, my dad whispered. It always knows everything. I don't know how. Nathaniel, listen to your mother. Come outside now. The voice changed and dropped, morphing into a deep growl as something pounded forcefully on the door. Come outside. Come outside now. I leapt back in fear, scrambling back away from the door with tears brimming in my eyes. My dad slowly stood, pumping the shotgun with a loud pop. The door was shaking, the locks rattling nearly off the hinges. Come outside, Nathaniel, the gnarled voice nearly sang. Something was tapping on the door now, no longer banging full force, but like fingernails tapping down and back up in quick succession, light as rain. Come outside or we'll come in. I pulled my knees up to my chest and I wrapped my arms around myself. Make it stop, I pleaded. Dad, please, just make it stop. My dad aimed the gun at the door as it continued. Suddenly, after what felt like an eternity, it stopped altogether. My dad lowered his gun and took a step closer to the door. He peered through the peephole and then, inexplicably, lifted his hand and slid the chain lock to the left, letting it swing undone. Stop, I called. What are you doing? Don't worry, he told me, sounding less confident than he looked. Everything is gonna be okay. I watched in abject terror as he undid the deadbolt and unlocked the doorknob, fishing in his pocket for the key to the padlock before kneeling to unlock that as well. Every single millimeter of metallic protection we had was just gone. I wanted to beg no, but I couldn't speak. He turned the knob and he pulled the door open. The porch light only cast a small halo of light in the inky black night, and wind blew the warm evening air inside. Nobody was standing there, but I could feel it watching. I peered around my dad and I blinked into the darkness. Something was moving in the black, slipping soundlessly through the trees, almost completely camouflaged by the cover of the night. But I could see the tiniest pinpricks of light moving, pacing back and forth, disappearing quickly and then reappearing. They were eyes reflecting the porch light and blinking. From the shadows, it began to scream. I covered my ears and cried, shutting out the pained howl. I closed my eyes as I waited for some unknown creature to gallop into the house and devour us whole. But instead, I heard the door slam shut. It's okay, Dad assured me, crouching down next to me and placing the gun on the floor. He grabbed my hands away from my ears and he held them with his own. It can't come inside. I know that now. It can't get us. It's okay. We'll have to call the police, I sobbed. We have to get Mom and leave here now. It's going to kill us. We can't. What? Why? That's what it wants, he said. It wants us to go. It wants us to flee. That's how it works. I don't understand what's happening, I said. Everything felt like the climax of a nightmare when you're waiting to wake up and worrying that all these horrible things are really happening. How do you know all of this? My dad sat back, keeping a firm hand on my arm. After the first night here, I did some research and found out about the last family. And then I found the rest through property records. Everyone who's lived here before us is dead. I don't know how or why, but I know that thing, whatever it is, has been responsible. This house, it's both a curse and protection. As long as we're here, I think we're safe, but if we leave... He trailed off, glancing at the door. I didn't need him to finish. I had read about those families, and I knew what would happen to us. And I knew I wasn't waking up. That was a few months ago. We told my mom soon after that night. She didn't believe us either until we showed her, and I don't think it's something you can accept until you experience it for yourself. But now she understands. We take shifts, switching off who keeps watch each night. Last Tuesday, we felt safe enough to forego a sign in a garden. We fell asleep in our rooms. It didn't like that. It needed an audience, and we woke up in the middle of the night to its shrieks. The door pounding off the hinges, slamming open and shut in heavy blows, and broken locks scattered on the floor. Every picture frame on the wall was broken. Every picture frame on the wall was broken, swinging precariously from their nails. And we'll never make that mistake again. I asked Dad why he bothered replacing the locks when he knew that it wouldn't make a difference either way. He says it's more symbolic than anything, maintaining this idea of peace in the face of something so helpless. I guess I know what he means. After all, I locked them in place a few minutes ago myself. It's my turn. I grabbed a book and I put on a rerun of a show I've seen 1,000 times. It makes me feel less alone for some reason. On a good night, I can get a few hours of sleep. I can ignore it when I hear my own voice, but it's hard when it's Mom and Dad. It's worse when it's something else. Sometimes, not often, I see it too. Just glimpses. A silhouette in the window, shadows passing under the door, and just once, black claws sneaking in to scratch the floor. I don't know if it's possible to look at it straight on, but I know I'll never try. It's quiet now. No crickets, no birds, no wind. Even the TV seems muted somehow. And that's how I know it's coming. It'll be back tonight, and every night, but so will we.
I know you're in there. I can hear you breathing.